their world, a woman's worth was measured in bloodlines and what her body could yield to the family name. Tess Miller stood in the study of Christian Adler, a man who ruled the city with a cold, lethal pragmatism, carrying a secret that should have made her obsolete. She expected him to discard her. Instead, when the truth finally spilled from her lips, he answered with a single word that tore down every wall she had ever built. The basement smelled of vinegar, dry rot, and old starch. It was the only room in the Adler estate that felt real to Tess. Upstairs, there were marble floors, polished to a mirror, shine heavy velvet drapes that blocked out the grey upstate New York winter, and men with thick necks who stood by the doors with their hands folded over their waistbands. But down here in the archive, there was only the quiet scrape of her scalpel against 90-year-old linen paper. Her name was Tess Miller. She was a paper conservator. Or at least she used to be, back when her life belonged to her. Now her life belonged to Christian Adler. 6 months ago, her brother Zoe made the mistake of trying to skim from one of Christian's construction fronts. It was a stupid, desperate move by a boy who thought he was cleverer than the devil. Christian didn't kill him. Instead, he took the debt added interest and took Tessa's collateral to ensure Zoe kept his hands clean and worked off what he owed in the shipping yards. Her job was simple: restore the family's private archives, ledgers, deeds, and letters dating back to the turn of the century. It was a front, of course, a way to keep her under his roof, visible, but out of the way. She didn't expect the silence. She had prepared herself for violence, for the crude demands of a man who owned the docks and half the politicians in the state. But Christian Adler was not a loud man. He didn't yell. He didn't even speak unless he absolutely had to. "You're squinting," a voice said from the shadows near the stairs. Tess didn't jump. She had grown used to the way he moved. Christian was tall, 36, with a frame that looked as though it had been carved out of granite and dressed in tailored charcoal wool. His hair was dark, cropped short, and his eyes were the flat, unreadable grey of a winter lake. "The light is bad down here," Tess said, not looking up from the page she was flattening. "The humidity is too high, too. If you want these ledgers to survive another decade, you need a dehumidifier. I'll have Arthur buy one." Christian stepped into the pool of light cast by her desk lamp. His hands were tucked into his pockets. He had a scar that ran from the knuckle of his left index finger all the way up under his cuff, a thick white ridge of tissue. "You've been down here 6 hours. I like the quiet." "It's not quiet," he said softly. "It's dead." He was right. The house was a tomb. Christian had inherited the leadership of the Adler Syndicate 2 years ago, after his father's stroke. Since then, he had lived here alone, surrounded by hired muscle and the ghosts of a family that had built its wealth on concrete and blood. He reached out his fingers, hovering just above the edge of the ancient ledger. He didn't touch it. He had a strange reverence for things that were broken. "My Uncle Sylvia is coming for dinner tomorrow," Christian said, her hand tensed on the scalpel. Sylvia was the elder statesman of the family, a traditionalist, the kind of man who still believed in blood oaths and the old ways. "Am I expected to stay in my room?" she asked. "No," Christian said. His grey eyes met hers, holding them with a weight that made it hard to breathe. I want you at the table. Christian, I'm your hostage, your collateral. It doesn't make sense for me to sit with your family. You aren't collateral anymore, Tess. Zoe's debt was cleared 3 weeks ago. The room seemed to tilt. The scalpel slipped from her fingers, clattering against the glass cutting mat. What? He's clean. I put him on a train to Chicago. He has a job there. A real one. Christian didn't blink. You're free to go. You have been for 21 days. Her throat felt dry like the old paper beneath her hands. Then why am I still here? Because you haven't asked for a taxi, he said simply. And because tomorrow Silvio is going to tell me I need to marry. He has a girl from the Chicago branch picked out. A cousin's daughter. A pure bloodline. A cold dread pulled in Tessa's stomach. The word bloodline always tasted like copper. And you want me there as a shield? She whispered. No, Christian said, his voice dropping an octave, turning rougher, more human than she had ever heard it. I want you there because I have no intention of marrying a girl from Chicago, and I want them to see what I've chosen instead. Tess looked down at her hands. They were stained with iron gall ink and paste. They were dry, practical hands, not the hands of a Mafia Dawn's wife, not the hands of someone who could carry the weight of his world. You don't know what you're asking, she said to the table. I know exactly what I'm asking, he said. He reached down, and for the first time, his hand brushed hers. His skin was warm, slightly rough. Sleep well, Tess. He turned and walked back into the dark of the basement stairs, leaving her with the smell of old paper and the sudden, terrifying realization that the cage door had been open for weeks, and she hadn't even tried to fly. The dress Christian had sent to her room was forest green silk. It had long sleeves, a high collar, and a hem that swept the floor. It was conservative, almost Victorian, but the silk clung to the curve of her hips and the small of her back in a way that made her feel entirely exposed. When they arrived at Silvio's estate on Long Island, the rain was coming down in sheets, turning the gravel driveway into a slick of grey mud. The dining room was a monument to old money and bad taste. Gold leaf moulding, heavy crystal chandeliers that hummed with cheap electricity, and a table long enough to host a small parliament. Silvio sat at the head. He was 70, with skin like yellowed parchment, and eyes that looked like yellowed lard. He didn't stand when they entered. Beside him sat his wife, Graziella, a woman who wore her diamonds like armor, and 2 younger men Tess recognized as Christians, Capos, Frank, and Terry. Christian. Silvio rumbled his voice like coal sliding down a chute. You're late. The fish is cold. The traffic on the bridge was backed up, Christian said, pulling out a heavy mahogany chair for Tess. He didn't look at Silvio. He didn't apologize. He just waited until she was seated before taking his own place at her right. Silvio's eyes drifted to her. They were small, wet, and utterly devoid of warmth. And this is the restorer, the girl from the basement. Her name is Tess, Christian said. His voice was conversational, but there was a sharp edge underneath, like a razor blade hidden in a loaf of bread. Graziella let out a small, dry, clicking sound with her tongue. A working girl. How lovely. Christian always did have a charitable heart, just like his mother. Poor thing. The implication was clear. Tess was a stray, a charity case, a temporary diversion for a man who had too much money and not enough sense. She kept her hands in her lap, gripping her napkin until her knuckles turned white. She thought about the hospital room. She thought about the smell of antiseptic, the blinding white glare of the overhead lights, and the flat, tired voice of the surgeon. 7 years ago, there was too much scar tissue test. The infection from the appendix had spread too far. We had to take it all. I'm sorry. She had been 22. She had sat in that thin paper gown, listening to the traffic outside on the highway, realizing that the future she had mapped out, the small house, the children laughing in the yard, the messy, chaotic warmth of a family had been scraped out of her while she was asleep. We need to talk about Chicago Christian, Silvio said, breaking the silence with a wet cough. He pointed his fork at Christian. The Genovese girl, Isabella, she's 24. Her father has 3 concrete plants and the dock workers' union in his pocket. It's a good match. Strong blood. Healthy. I'm not marrying Isabella, Christian said. He took a sip of his red wine. It was a heavy, dark vintage that looked like blood in the candlelight. Silvio slammed his hand on the table. The crystal rattled. You think this is a game? You're 36 years old. The family needs an anchor, Christian. A man without a son is just a tenant in his own house. You die tomorrow. And what happens to the Adler name? It goes to the cousins in Jersey, to the state. The name is fine, Christian said. The name needs a womb, Silvio roared, his face turning a dark, mottled purple. You need a wife who can give you 3 boys before the decade is out. You need a woman who knows her place and knows her duty. Graziella nodded in silent agreement, her eyes fixed on Tess, like a hawk watching a mouse in the grass. It's the way things are done, Christian. Your father understood that. He married me because my father owned the trucks. You marry for the future, not for whatever this is. She gestured toward Tess with a manicured hand. The room grew very cold. The air seemed to thin out until Tess could hear the hum of the freezer in the kitchen. Christian didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look angry. He just leaned back in his chair, his long fingers tracing the rim of his wine glass. My father is in a nursing home in Queens, Graziella, Christian said softly. He doesn't know his own name, and he hasn't spoken a word in 2 years. His trucks are parked in a yard that belongs to the city. I don't care about his way of doing things. He stood up. He didn't look at Silvio or Graziella. He looked down at Tess. Get your coat, Tess, he said. The fisher's cold. As they walked out, Silvio's voice followed them down the long carpeted hallway, muffled but heavy with malice. You're making a mistake. Christian Amann, who doesn't build a house, is just waiting for the wind to blow it down. The rain outside was freezing, now turning into sleet that stung her face as they ran for the car. In the back seat of the armored sedan, Christian sat in the dark. His jaw set, his eyes fixed on the wet asphalt rushing beneath them. Tess looked at him, and for the first time she felt a deep, aching terror. Not of him, but for him and for herself, because she knew the truth. And the truth was a bomb waiting to go off in his perfect, cold world. The drive back to the estate was silent. The only sound was the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers and the low hum of the heater. When they got inside, Christian went straight to his study. Tess followed him. She didn't want to go to her quiet room in the basement. She didn't want to lie in the dark and let the memory of Silvio's words eat away at her stomach. The study was dark, lit only by the embers of a dying fire in the hearth. Christian poured 2 glasses of rye whiskey, his hand steady his back to her. "You don't have to do this," Tess said, her voice barely louder than the crackle of the wood. He turned, holding out one of the glasses. "Do what?" "Fight them for me." She didn't take the glass. She kept her hands tucked into the sleeves of her green dress, trying to stay warm. Silvio is right. In your world, a wife isn't just a partner. She's an investment, a guarantee for the future. You need someone who can give you what they want. "I don't care what they want," Christian said. He set both glasses down on the heavy oak desk. "I care about what I want." "And what do you want, Christian?" He walked toward her, his steps slow, deliberate. The firelight caught the edge of his jaw, the hard line of his mouth. "I want a woman who looks at me and doesn't see a monster. I want someone who knows what it is to be broken and doesn't try to hide the scars. I want you, Tess," her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, trapped thing. "You don't know me. You know the girl you kept in your basement. You know the girl who restores your books. I know the way you breathe when you're working," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He was close now. She could smell the rye on his breath, the clean, cold scent of the rain on his wool coat. "I know the way you look at the rain. I know you haven't smiled once since you got here. But today, when you looked at that old ledger from 1912, your eyes went soft. I want that softness. I need it." "No," she said, stepping back until a spine hit the door frame. "No, Christian, you don't understand." "Then make me understand." The tears came, then hot and stinging, burning the backs of her eyes. She hated them. She hated how weak they made her feel. How small. "They want an heir," she whispered. "Silvio, the family. I don't care about an heir." "You will," she cried, the words tearing out of her throat, raw and ugly. "Everyone does. When you're 40, when you're 50, when you look around this house and there's no one to carry your name, you'll care, and you'll look at me, and you'll hate me." Christian stopped. He stood 2 feet away from her, his face cast in shadow, his body perfectly still. "Tess," he said, his voice leveled dangerous in its quietness. "What are you talking about?" She took a deep breath, the air tasting like copper and ash. She looked him dead in the eyes, letting him see the hollow, broken thing she had been carrying inside her for 7 years. "I can't have kids," she whispered. "I had an infection when I was 22. They had to take everything. I am barren, Christian. I can never give you a son. I can never give you a daughter. I can never give you a family." She closed her eyes, waiting for the shift in the air. She waited for the coldness to settle back into his face, for the polite distance of a man who realized he had made a bad investment. She waited for him to tell her Arthur would call a cab in the morning. The silence dragged on. It felt like hours, just the drip of the rain outside and the thump of her own useless heart. Then she felt his hand. It wasn't gentle, not exactly. His fingers were firm as they cupped her jaw, his thumb wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. He forced her chin up, forcing her to look at him. His grey eyes weren't cold. They were dark, burning with a strange, fierce intensity that made her shiver. "Good," Christian said. Tess blinked, the word echoing in her ears like a gunshot. "What?" "Good," he repeated, his voice, thick, rough, and entirely devoid of hesitation. "I don't want them, Christian. Listen to me, he said, his grip tightening just enough to keep her still, to keep her anchored to him. You think I want to bring a child into this house? You think I want to look at a boy and know that before he's 10, he'll have to learn how to clean a gun? You think I want to spend every night wondering if someone is going to put a bullet through my daughter's window just to get to me? He leaned down until his forehead touched hers. His breath was hot against her skin. My father spent his whole life building this empire for his sons, Christian whispered. And look at us. My brother is dead in a ditch in Jersey. I'm a target every time I start my car. The Adler name isn't a legacy test. It's a disease, and it dies with me. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his fingers sliding into her hair, holding her close. I don't want a legacy, he said, his voice breaking with an emotion he had kept buried under 36 yards of concrete and blood. I want you, just you. I want to come home to this empty, quiet house and know that you're here. That's the only future I care about. The walls she had built around her chest, the neat, dry boxes where she kept her grief and her shame, crumbled all at once. Turning to dust, she reached out her hands, finding the lapels of his coat gripping the heavy wool, as if it were the only solid thing in a world that was spinning out of control. Are you sure? She sobbed. Christian, are you sure? He didn't answer with words. He leaned down and kissed her a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of rye rain and the sweet, terrifying promise of a beginning. Morning in the Adler estate usually felt like waking up inside a vault. The thick stone walls swallowed the sounds of the outside world, leaving only the low mechanical hum of the central heating. But this morning was different. Tess woke up in a bed that wasn't hers. The sheets were heavy Egyptian cotton, smelling faintly of cedar, and the sharp, clean scent of Christian's soap. She lay still for a long time, watching the grey winter light filter through the tall windows. He was already awake. Christian sat in a leather armchair in the corner of the room, dressed in dark trousers and a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He was watching her. He held a cup of coffee in one hand, resting it on his knee. You didn't sleep much, he said. His voice was growly quiet in the vastness of the bedroom. Neither did you. She sat up, pulling the thick duvet up to her collarbone. Her green silk dress from the night before was folded neatly over the back of a chair. The memory of the previous night, the heat of his hands, the desperate, crushing weight of his confession, hit her all at once. Her chest tightened. Are you going to regret this in the daylight? Christian took a slow sip of his coffee. He didn't smile, but the hard lines around his mouth softened. I don't do regrets, Tess. They're a waste of time. I do logistics. He stood up, walked over to the bed, and set his mug on the nightstand. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a heavy ring of keys and dropped them onto the mattress beside her. They landed with a dull clink. What's this? She asked. The house, the gates, the cars in the garage. He looked down at her, his grey eyes steady and clear. You aren't a guest anymore. You aren't a captive. This is your house. If you want to leave, you leave. If you want to stay, you stay. But you don't live in the basement anymore. She looked at the keys. For 6 months, those jagged pieces of brass had represented her absolute containment. Now they were an offering, The light is better in the East Solarium. Christian continued his tone, shifting to something purely practical. Arthur is having your work tables moved up there today. The humidity controls have already been installed. You did that this morning. I made the calls at 5 a.m. He leaned down, bracing his hands on the mattress on either side of her hips. He was close enough that she could see the tiny flecks of silver in his irises. I meant what I said last night, Tess. All of it. We are going to build a life here, just you and me. But it's going to get ugly before it gets quiet. Silvio, she said the name, leaving a sour taste in her mouth. Silvio Christian confirmed. He won't accept a quiet retirement. He won't accept that the bloodline ends. He will push. And what happens when he pushes? Christian didn't blink. I push back harder. He straightened up, adjusting his cuffs. Frank and Terry are downstairs. They're your detail now. Whenever you leave the grounds, they go with you. No exceptions. It was a cold splash of reality. The fantasy of the night before, the idea that love or desire could erase the grim mechanics of the mob, vanished. Christian was a syndicate boss. He had enemies. And by choosing her, he had just made her the biggest target in his world. She didn't argue. She threw off the covers and swung her legs out of bed. The hardwood floor was freezing against her bare feet. She walked over to the chair, picked up her green dress, and looked at him. Tell Arthur I want the old ledger from 1912 on my desk first, she said, keeping her voice perfectly level. The binding is rotting. It needs immediate attention. Christian watched her, a slow, genuine respect dawning in his eyes. He recognized survival when he saw it. He recognized grit. I'll tell him, Christian said. Tess spent the afternoon in the solarium. The room was a massive expanse of glass and steel overlooking the dormant rose gardens. Arthur Christian's aging, impeccably dressed fixer had indeed moved her entire life upstairs. Her scalpels, the bone folders, the Japanese tissue paper, and the wheat starch paste were all laid out on a long oak table. For the first time in 7 years, she didn't feel like a discarded thing hiding in the dark. She sat in the natural light, carefully lifting a layer of grime from a century-old shipping manifest. She was preserving history, but for the first time, she cleared throat wasn't burying herself in it. She was waiting for the war to start. She just didn't expect it to walk right through her front door. The war arrived on a Tuesday, wearing a vicuna wool coat and smelling of expensive cologne and stale cigar smoke. Christian was down at the shipyards. There had been a sudden unexplained strike, organized by the dock workers' union. A union controlled entirely by Silvio's deep pockets. It was a calculated move, a financial bleed designed to remind Christian who actually controlled the arteries of the family's wealth. Tess was in the solarium, working a delicate tear in a property deed when the heavy oak doors of the room swung open. Arthur stepped in first. His face, usually a mask of polite indifference, was tight. A purple bruise was forming along his jawline. Behind him walked a man she didn't know. He was in his late 20s, slick and handsome in a predatory, restless way. He had dark hair slicked back with paid, and eyes that darted around the room, assessing the value of everything he saw. He was followed by 2 massive men whose suits bulged awkwardly at the shoulders and ribs. Arthur? She stood up, dropping her bone folder. My apologies, Miss Miller, Arthur said, his voice strained. Mr. Geneves insisted on coming inside to wait for Christian. He bypassed the gate security. Geneves, Chicago. This was the brother of the girl Silvio wanted Christian to marry. Dominic Genevesi, the man said, stepping around Arthur. He didn't offer his hand. He kept his hands in his coat pockets, looking around the solarium with a smirk. Nice glass house. Little drafty, though, so you're the mechanic. I am a conservator, Tess said, keeping her voice flat. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she kept her hands resting lightly on the edge of the worked. She refused to back away. Dominic chuckled. He walked over to the table, his eyes skimming over her tools, the delicate Japanese paper, the open ledgers. Right, the paper, girl. Silvio told me Christian lost his mind. I had to come see it for myself. My sister Isabella is sitting in a penthouse in the Gold Coast, waiting for a ring, and Adler is holed up with a librarian. If you have business with Christian, he will be back in an hour, she said. You can wait in the driveway. Dominic's smirk faded. The ugly, violent nature beneath his tailored suit rose to the surface. He stepped closer to her, invading her space. He smelled of peppermint and something metallic. You don't give orders here, sweetheart, Dominic said softly. You're a phase, a midlife crisis. My family has 3,000 union men ready to freeze Adler's concrete and shipping businesses until he bleeds out. Silvio gave him a choice. He either marries Isabella and binds the families, or we take it all. There's no third option. He reached out his thick fingers, hovering over the 1912 ledger she had spent the last 3 days restoring. Don't touch that, she said. Dominic looked at her, his eyes dead and mocking. He deliberately pressed his thumb down hard onto the brittle century-old paper. She heard the sickening crack of the fibers snapping. A hot, blinding fury spiked in her chest. It wasn't just about the book. It was about the utter entitlement, the belief that they could come into her house, touch her things, and dictate the course of her life, because their blood was supposedly better than hers. She didn't think. She moved. She picked up the number 10 surgical scalpel from her cutting mat. In one smooth motion, she slammed the blade down into the heavy oak table, sinking it 1/2 inch into the wood, right between Dominic's index and middle fingers. The vibration hummed through the handle. Dominic flinched violently, pulling his hand back as if he had been burned. The 2 gorillas behind him reached inside their jackets. Put them back, a voice snapped from the doorway. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Christian stood there. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely hollowed out, his grey eyes devoid of anything human. Frank and Terry flanked him, their weapons already drawn and levelled at Dominic's men. Dominic recovered his composure, letting out a short, nervous laugh. Christian, good. Tell your straight to calm down before she cuts herself. Christian walked into the room. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, on the marble floor. He didn't look at the ledger. He didn't look at the scalpel. He looked at the bruise on Arthur's jaw. You touched my man, Christian said, his voice a quiet, terrifying rasp. You came into my house. We're family, Adler, Dominic sneered, though he took a step back. I came to talk sense into you. The docks are shut down. Your cement trucks are parked. You're losing a H100 Red Grand an hour. Dump the barren chick, marry my sister, and we turn the faucets back on. Tess stopped breathing. The barren chick, Silvio had told them. They had weaponized her deepest shame into a bargaining chip. She looked at Christian, waiting for the hesitation, waiting for the businessman to weigh the 100 grand an hour against the woman standing in the glass room. Christian stopped 2 feet from Dominic. Frank Christian said, never breaking eye contact with Dominic. Yeah, boss. Call the port authority. Tell them the Genovese shipments coming in from Montreal tonight have a false manifest. Tell them to check the cavities in the steel pipes for fentanyl. Dominic's face went chalk white. You're bluffing. You wouldn't rat out family. The commission will put a hit on you so fast. I don't care about the commission, Christian said. He moved so fast, she barely saw it. His hand shot out, grabbing Dominic by the throat, slamming the younger man backward into one of the steel support pillars of the solarium. The glass panes rattled. Dominic gagged his hands, clawing uselessly at Christian's wrist. Dominic's guards twitched, but Frank and Terry racked the slides of their Glocks, the metallic clack freezing the room. Listen to me very carefully, Christian whispered, leaning into Dominic's face. There is no alliance. There is no marriage. You shut down my docks. Fine. I'll burn your supply lines to the ground. You want a war of attrition. I have more money, more time, and, clear as throat, absolutely nothing to lose. I will bankrupt your father, and I will bury you under your own union hall. Christian's grip tightened. Dominic's face was turning a deep, mottled red. And if you ever, Christian, said his voice, dropping to a demonic register, speak about my partner like that again, I won't use a scalpel. I will use a claw hammer. Nod, if you understand. Dominic gasped, managing a frantic, jerky nod. Christian threw him to the floor. Dominic collapsed, coughing violently, dragging air into his lungs. Get out, Christian said, stepping over him. Take the FDR drive back to the city. If my men see your car in upstate New York again, they have orders to shoot the block. Dominic scrambled up, humiliated, terrified, and outmatched. He and his men practically ran out of the solarium. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them. Silence descended on the glass room, save for the sound of rain beginning to patter against the roof. The adrenaline left her body in a sudden, sickening rush. Her knees went weak, and she had to grip the edge of the oak table to keep from collapsing. She stared at the scalpel, still embedded in the wood, quivering slightly from the residual tension. Christian didn't move toward her immediately. He stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving as he brought the violence back under control. He looked down at his hands, rubbing the scar on his knuckle, taking deep, slow breaths. Arthur Christian said, his back still to the room. Yes, sir, Arthur replied, pressing a handkerchief to his bruised jaw. Have the gate guards replaced. If anyone sets foot on this property without my direct authorization, again, I'll hold the guards personally responsible and double Frank and Terry's hazard pay. Right away, sir. Arthur bowed his head slightly and quietly left the room. They were alone. The grey afternoon light washed over Christian, casting long, sharp shadows across his face. He finally turned to look at her. The dead, hollow look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, naked exhaustion. He walked over to the table. He reached out and wrapped his hand around the handle of the scalpel. With a sharp tug, he pulled it out of the wood and laid it gently on the cutting mat. Did he touch you? Christian asked. No. Her voice was shaking. She hated it. She wanted to be strong, to match the cold iron he had just displayed, but she was shaking. He touched the book. Christian looked at the cracked spine of the ledger. Then he looked at her. He reached out, taking her trembling, paste-stained hands in his large, warm ones. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "For what?" she asked, looking up at him. "For saving my life, for defending me, for bringing this into your life." He stepped closer, crowding her against the table, but there was no threat in his posture, only a desperate need for proximity. "I wanted to keep you safe from this. I wanted to build a wall high enough that the blood couldn't reach us." "You can't," she said. "You're Christian Adler. You don't get to step out of the shadows just because you found someone who likes the light. Tess, they know Christian." She pulled her hands back, wrapping her arms around her chest. The shame from Dominic's words was still a cold knot in her stomach. Silvio told them, "They know I can't have kids. They know I'm a dead end for you. They're going to use it against you. They're going to make you look weak to the other families. A boss who chooses a barren woman over a strategic alliance. They'll tear your empire apart." Christian's jaw tightened. "Let them." "You don't mean that." "I mean exactly that," he said, stepping into her space, forcing her to look up at him. He didn't touch her. He just held her with his eyes. "Do you think I care about the docks? Do you think I care about the cement plants? My father bled for those things, and he's rotting in a bed, eating out of a tube. The families, the commission. Silvio, they worship ghosts, Tess. They worship a future that doesn't exist." He reached up his fingers, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was so jarringly gentle compared to the violence she had just witnessed. "I told you last night," Christian said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want you. They can have the docks. They can have the concrete. I will burn it all to ash before I let them dictate who I come home to." Tess stared at him, the reality of what he was saying finally taking root in her chest. He wasn't just rejecting an arranged marriage. He was rejecting his entire world. He was using her supposed flaw, her brokenness as his shield and his sword. She wasn't his weakness. She was his exit strategy. "They'll try to kill you," she whispered. "They can try," Christian replied, a dark, grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. "But I'm very good at keeping what's mine." He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't the desperate, questioning kiss of the night before. This was a claiming. It was deep bruising and tasted of adrenaline and peppermint, and the absolute certainty of a man who had made his final choice. She kissed him back, her hands sliding up his chest, gripping the lapels of his jacket. She felt the hard, unforgiving shape of the shoulder holster beneath his coat. But she didn't pull away. She pulled him closer. She had spent 7 years grieving a life she couldn't have. She had mourned the phantom children, the quiet suburban house, the normally that was taken from her on a surgical table. But standing here in a glass room surrounded by the wreckage of Mafia politics, kissing a man with blood on his hands and iron in his spine, she realized something. She didn't want a normal life. She wanted him. When they finally broke apart, Christian rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady for the first time since Dominic had walked through the door. Christian pulled back his eyes, hardening, as he looked out the rain-slicked windows toward the iron gates of the estate. Now, Christian said, we go on the offensive. We don't wait for Sylvia to make the next move. We cut the head off the snake. He took her hand, his grip tight and unyielding. Come on, he said. You're going to help me dismantle my father's empire. The Adler Syndicate was not a single tangible thing you could burn with a match. It was a ghost ship floating on a sea of shell companies' union kickbacks and real estate trusts holding properties that didn't exist. To destroy it, you didn't need a hit squad. You needed a forensic accountant with nothing to lose. Or in Christian's case, a paper conservator who knew how to read the history of dead men. They started that night in the basement archive. Christian didn't want the digital files. He knew Silvio and his father had kept the real secrets off the servers. The true leverage was in ink and pulp. Silvio controls the ports because he controls the union president. Christian said he was sitting on the edge of her work desk, his tie discarded, top button undone. He had a glass of water in one hand and a stack of yellowed receipts in the other. But before he was the elder statesman, he ran the numbers for my father in the 80s. The Genovese family supplied the concrete for the high-rises in Manhattan. Sylvia was the middleman. Tess sat under the harsh glare of the H halogen lamp, carefully separating pages of a 1986 ledger with a bone folder. The pages were brittle smelling of cigar smoke and decades of damp basement air. And you think he skimmed? I know he skimmed, Christian said, his voice flat. Silvio is a greedy man. He built his estate in Long Island on cash he bled from my father's margins. But my father was blind to it. If Sylvia was skimming from the Adlers, he was definitely skimming from the Genovese. We just need the proof. Tess nodded, adjusting her glasses. Her fingers moved mechanically, scraping away dried glue to reveal columns of faded blue ink. If we find it, what do you do with it? I don't show it to the feds, Christian said. I send it to Dominic's father in Chicago. The commission doesn't forgive theft between families. If the Genovese patriarch sees that Silvio robbed him of millions 30 years ago, the alliance is dead. Silvio becomes a liability. They'll cut him off, and the Union strike at the docks will collapse. It was a brilliant, vicious strategy. Christian was turning the old guard's paranoia against them. For 3 days, they barely slept. They lived on black coffee-cold sandwiches Arthur brought down on silver trays, and the quiet electric charge of their shared rebellion. The estate above them felt empty, locked down tight by Frank Terry and a dozen new guards patrolling the perimeter with dogs. Tess stopped feeling like a captive. She felt like an architect dismantling a prison from the inside out. On Thursday, at 3 o'clock in the morning, her scalpel slipped beneath a false backing on the inside cover of the 1986 ledger. The cardboard felt unusually thick. She slid the blade horizontally, severing the old animal hide glue. A small folded piece of onion skin paper fell onto the glass mat. "Christian," she whispered. He was beside her in a second. Tess used a pair of flat tweezers to unfold the paper. It was a secondary ledger sheet, 2 columns, one marked a concrete, the other marked G dispersed. Beside it was a third, smaller column labeled S reserve. The numbers in the S reserve column were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, week after week, siphoned off the top before the Genovese family ever saw their cut. At the bottom, signed in a tight, cramped cursive, were the initials S.A. Silvio Adler. Christian stared at the paper. A slow, dark satisfaction settled over his features. The kind of look a wolf gets right before it closes its jaws. He kept the receipts, Tess said, her voice barely above her breath. He was so arrogant, he actually documented his own theft. He didn't think anyone would ever look, Christian said. He reached out his hand, hovering over her mouth. He thought the women in this family were just wombs, and the men were just muscle. He never accounted for you, Tess. Christian took the paper. Arthur, he called out. Footsteps hurried down the wooden stairs. Arthur appeared in the doorway, looking impeccably awake despite the hour. Sir, scan this, encrypted. I want a secure courier to take the physical copy to the Genovese compound in Chicago by noon tomorrow. Hand it directly to the old man and Arthur. Yes, Christian. Liquidate the holding company that owns the Long Island estate. Silvio's name is on the deed, but the Adler Trust holds the mortgage. Call in the debt. Give him 24 hours to vacate. Arthur's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch, the only sign of his shock. Sir, that is a declaration of war. No, Arthur, Christian said, looking at Tess. It's an eviction notice. The war is already over. The fallout was immediate, and it was deafening. By Friday evening, the silence of their upstate fortress was broken by the frantic ringing of the secure landlines. The Genovese patriarch had received the ledger sheet. The Union strike at Christian's docks was instantly dissolved. Dominic Geneves was abruptly recalled to Chicago, his tail between his legs, the marriage alliance completely shattered. But Sylvia was a cornered rat, and cornered rats do not die quietly. The storm hit just past midnight. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, masking the sound of approaching engines until they were already at the main gate. Tess was in the kitchen, pouring, clear's throat, 2 mugs of tea, when the perimeter alarm shrieked, a high, piercing wail that vibrated in her teeth. Christian was through the swinging doors before she could even set the kettle down. He had a matte black Sig Sauer in his hand. He didn't look panicked. He looked like a machine that had just been switched on. Away from the windows, he ordered, grabbing her arm and pulling her into the heavy stone corridor that led to the basement. Is it Chicago? She asked, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. No, Chicago wouldn't breach a gate. They'd send a lawyer or a sniper, Christian said. This is Silvio. He's desperate. The Genovese just put a bounty on his head for the stolen money. He has nowhere to go. Gunfire erupted outside. It wasn't the continuous roar of an action movie. It was sharp, isolated pops. Crack, crack. The sound of professional men doing terrible work in the dark, Frank Christian said into a small radio clipped to his belt. Front gate is holding. Boss Frank's voice crackled back, breathing heavy. 4 SUVs. They rammed the iron. Terry took out the lead driver. They're trying to push through on foot. It's Silvio's personal detail. Pin them down. Do not let them reach the steps. I'm coming out. Christian. No. She grabbed his arm, the fabric of his shirt bunched in her fists. You don't have to go out there. We have the basement. We have the steel doors. Let the guards handle it. He stopped. He looked down at her hands, gripping him like a lifeline. and then up at her face. The coldness in his eyes fractured, revealing the man she had spoken to in the study. If I stay inside, he'll siege the house. Someone will get lucky, and a bullet will come through a wall, Christian said softly. I told you I'd protect what is mine. That means finishing this in the rain, not in our hallway. He reached out his thumb, brushing over her cheekbone. Go to the archive. Lock the vault door. Do not open it for anyone but me or Arthur. Tess wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him she wasn't a fragile thing to be hidden away. But she looked at the gun in his hand and the hard line of his jaw, and she knew this wasn't about her pride. It was about survival. She nodded once. Christian turned and ran toward the front foyer. Tess turned and ran for the stairs. The archive vault was a heavy steel room built by Christian's grandfather. It smelled of ozone and old paper. She slammed the heavy door shut, spun the locking wheel, and backed away until her shoulders hit the cold concrete wall. The silence inside the vault was absolute. She couldn't hear the rain. She couldn't hear the gunfire. She was entirely cut off from the world. It was agonizing. She stared at the metal door, her mind projecting horrors onto its surface. She saw Christian bleeding on the wet asphalt. She saw Silvio stepping over his body. She saw the door handle begin to turn. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. She paced the length of the room. She looked at the 1912 ledger sitting on her desk, the one Dominic had cracked. She had repaired the spine. It was whole again, stronger than it was before, braced with new linen threads. Broken things can be fixed, she thought. But you have to survive the breaking first. Suddenly, the heavy metallic clank of the locking mechanism echoed through the room. The wheel began to spin. She backed up, grabbing the heavy bone folder from her desk, her knuckles turning white. She held her breath. The door swung open. Arthur stood there. His suit was wet, plastered to his shoulders. There was a smear of grease on his cheek, but his posture was perfectly straight. Miss Miller, Arthur said quietly. It's over. She dropped the bone folder. Christian, he's waiting for you upstairs. She ran past him, taking the wooden stairs 2 at a time. She burst into the main hallway. The heavy oak front doors were wide open, letting in the cold, wet wind and the smell of sulfur and rain. Christian was standing on the front porch. He was soaked to the bone, his white shirt clinging to his skin, his hair plastered to his forehead. He was watching a pair of black SUVs reverse down the driveway, their headlights cutting through the storm. On the steps, face down, in a puddle of muddy water, was a man. He wasn't dead, but his hands were zip-tied behind his back. It was Silvio. Tess stepped out onto the porch, shivering in the cold air. Christian turned to her. He dropped his gun onto a patio chair. He didn't look triumphant. He looked exhausted. Is he? She couldn't finish the sentence. He's alive, Christian said, his voice raspy. I disarmed his men. Frank and Terry let the rest run. Silvio tried to shoot his way through the front door. She looked down at the old man. He looked small, stripped of his tailored suits and his oak-paneled dining rooms. He was just a miserable, greedy old man lying in the mud. What happens to him? She asked. Frank is driving him to the airfield, Christian said, not looking at his uncle. I chartered a plane to Bogota. He has a passport and $50,000 in a duffel bag. He can never come back to the States. If he does, the Geneves will kill him. If he tries to contact the commission, I release the rest of the ledgers and bury his entire bloodline in federal indictments. Silvio groaned, turning his head to look up at Christian. The rain washed the mud from his wrinkled face. You killed the family, Christian. You ended it all for a Baron. Christian didn't flinch. He didn't yell. He just walked down the steps, crouched beside Silvio, and spoke in a voice so low it barely carried over the rain. The family was already dead. Silvio. It died a long time ago. I just stopped pretending the corpse was breathing. Christian stood up. He gestured to Frank, who hauled Silvio to his feet and dragged him toward a waiting car. Tess watched the tail lights disappear down the long, winding driveway. The heavy iron gates swung shut behind them, locking with a definitive mechanical clang. The estate was quiet again. But it wasn't the dead, heavy silence of a tomb anymore. It was the silence of a slate wiped clean. Christian walked back up the steps. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Tess stepped forward and took them in hers. They were freezing. "It's over," he whispered, resting his forehead against hers. "The docks, the concrete, the commission. Tomorrow I sign the businesses over to the unions and the foreman. Let them fight over the scraps. The Adler syndicate is finished." "What does that leave us?" she asked, looking up into his grey eyes. "A house," Christian said. His thumb brushed over her bottom lip. "A ridiculous amount of clean money and time. Lots of time." She leaned up and kissed him, tasting the rain on his skin. She wasn't collateral anymore, and he wasn't a king trapped in a concrete castle. They were just two people standing in the ruins of an empire, ready to build something real. 6 months later, the basement archive was completely empty. The heavy steel vault door was propped open with a wooden door's stop. The halogen lamps were gone, the dehumidifiers unplugged. The smell of vinegar and old starch had faded, replaced by the scent of pine cleaner and fresh air drifting down from the open windows upstairs. Tess stood in the center of the room, holding a small cardboard box. Inside were her scalpels, the bone folders, and the Japanese tissue paper, the tools of her trade. She was packing them up, not to put them away, but to move them to the East Solarium permanently. "You missed a spot," she turned. Christian was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame. He was wearing faded jeans and a plain grey t-shirt. The tailored charcoal suits had been donated to a charity drive in the city 3 months ago. His dark hair was a little longer, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. He looked younger. He looked lighter. "I'm just making sure I didn't leave any scraps behind," she said, hoisting the box onto her hip. Christian walked over and took the box from her, his fingers brushing hers. "Arthur is already loading the truck with the old furniture. We don't need to keep any of it. If you want to gut this room and turn it into a wine cellar, we can do that." Tess looked around the concrete walls. This room had been her cage. It had been the place where she hid from the world, convinced that her lack of a future meant she only belonged in the past. "No wine cellar," she said. "Let's turn it into a greenhouse. Put in some grow lights. We can start the rose seedlings down here during the winter before moving them to the gardens." Christian smiled. It was a rare, beautiful thing, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners. A greenhouse in a Mafia bunker. The feds would be very confused if they ever served a warrant. There are no feds coming, Christian, she reminded him gently. I know. He set the box down on the floor and pulled her into his arms. His body was warm and solid. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, calm rhythm of his heartbeat. The transition hadn't been easy. Dismantling a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise required armies of lawyers, endless NDAs, and careful navigation of offshore accounts. There were weeks where Christian spent 18 hours a day on secure phone lines, aggressively detaching the Adler name from every illicit port and union hall on the East Coast. But he did it. He sold the legitimate assets, paid off the necessary politicians to look the other way, and dissolved the rest into a charitable foundation, run by a board of directors who thought Christian was simply an eccentric heir seeking early retirement. The other families let him go without Silvio stoking the fires, and without the Adler infrastructure to fight over Christian was no longer a threat. He was just a ghost who had cashed out. Arthur found a property in Vermont. Christian murmured into her hair. 100 acres. It has a barn that could easily be converted into a massive conservation studio for you. She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. Are we leaving New York? We can, if you want, or we can stay here. He shrugged a gesture of absolute freedom. This house used to feel like a graveyard, but lately it just feels like home. It is home, she said. She reached up and traced the white scar on his left knuckle. He didn't pull away. He never hid his scars from her. And she never hid her broken pieces from him. They didn't have a bloodline to protect. They didn't have a legacy to pass on. When Sylvia had shouted that she was barren, he meant it as a curse. He meant it to signify that she was a dead end. But he was wrong. A bloodline is a chain. It's a series of heavy iron links binding one generation to the mistakes, the debts, and the violence of the last. Christian was expected to forge the next link. He was expected to hand a gun to a son and tell him to guard the concrete throne, because she couldn't give him that she gave him the only thing that mattered an ending. By ending the line, they broke the chain. They bought their freedom with the very thing they deemed a flaw. What are you thinking about? Christian asked, his voice a low rumble. I'm thinking about the 1912 ledger. She lied smoothly, a small smile playing on her lips. I'm thinking about how much I love fixing things. You already fixed me, he said. You weren't broken, Christian, she whispered, reaching up to press a kiss to his jaw. You were just buried. I just helped dig you out. He kissed her, then slow and deep, pulling her tight against his chest. There was no desperation in it anymore, no fear of the dark outside the gates. It was just the quiet, enduring heat of a fire built to last. They walked up the basement stairs together, leaving the heavy steel door open behind them. The house above was flooded with morning light. The velvet drapes had been taken down. The armed guards were gone, replaced by a simple security system. They walked into the kitchen. Arthur was standing by the counter, dressed in a comfortable cardigan, instead of his usual tailored suit, pouring 3 cups of coffee. Good morning, Miss Tess Christian, Arthur said, sliding 2 mugs across the granite island. The weather report says it should be clear all weekend, perfect for planting. Thanks, Arthur, she said, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic mug. Tess stood next to Christian, looking out the kitchen window at the expansive lawns rolling down toward the tree-line. The trees were green, vibrant, and alive. There would be no children playing on that lawn. There would be no heirs to inherit the stone walls or the bank accounts. Someday they would grow old, and the Adler name would finally fade away into the history books, entirely forgotten by the world that used to fear it. And as Christian slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close against his side in the sunlit kitchen, she realized exactly how she felt about that. She felt perfectly, beautifully complete. If Tess and Christian's journey from captive and captor to equals, breaking the chains of a toxic legacy, moved you, let us know. Did you expect Christian to tear down his entire empire for the woman he loved? Their story proves that sometimes our greatest perceived flaws are actually our ultimate salvation. If you loved this deep, grounded dive into Mafia romance and want more stories where broken people find strength in each other, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable audio dramas. See you next time.